Seattle is the best city in the world. And at the Super Bowl celebration before the parade last week, Ernest Jones had a good message for all the haters. He said, "We're here to stay and we ain't going nowhere." And that's how I feel about Team Seattle too. Thank you.
Well, that's Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson delivering her first State of the City address this week. What are the top issues she is focusing on? And also, what's happening with the Seattle City Council as they are considering a bill to prevent federal immigration and customs enforcement from opening new jail cells in the city? Plus, a related story there, the future of surveillance cameras in Seattle. What is next for that controversial project? All this and more on this edition of Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host and producer on the Seattle channel, and the views expressed here are mine. I am back with my friend and co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, spring training really getting warmed up for the Seattle Mariners in Arizona this week. And I got to say, the first game, the inter-squad games and all that, that starts on Friday. I know the games don't really mean a lot, but I did want to ask that question. How important is a good spring training record to you? What does that say to you about a team?
It says nothing to me at all.
Okay.
I hope they take full advantage of letting, the young players try some stuff out and fail, and that's okay. And, I see no correlation between how well they do in spring training and the actual season.
Fair enough. Because sometimes I know when they go undefeated, they really don't do that well in the regular year.
Right.
So
Yeah, exactly.
that's important to point that out. Thank you, David. As always, thanks to patrons of the show, too. Shout out to Caden for becoming a paid member this past week. Much appreciated. I'll be sending Caden, I should say, a Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal very soon. Caden's all set up to also get Patrons First podcast before anybody else. So be cool like Caden and become a patron already. Patronage levels start at just $5 a month. That's Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, play ball. Time for Right Here, Right Now. All right, David, let's get to it. Mayor Wilson made her first State of the City address on Tuesday. The top 3 points she talked about, as I was following along there, included a focus on public safety, especially after some recent gun violence in the Rainier Beach neighborhood, a discussion of homelessness and encampment sweeps, and a response to federal immigration enforcement in Seattle. We're going to pull apart some surveillance camera and homelessness issues a bit later in the show, but I just wanted to get a heat check from you. How did she do? What stood out to you about this presentation?
Yeah, and I mean, it was at the Langston Hughes Center in Central District, and it was well attended. I guess my my first reaction is, she said after she was elected that she knows that she will be most likely judged on how she does with homelessness and public safety. And I know we'll talk more about homelessness later, but I think it's no accident that the first two things that she started talking about were public safety and homelessness. I think she acknowledges that those are what voters care most about, and if there are failings, they're going to pin them on her. And so, that stood out to me. And the other piece is, if you were looking for the radical socialist overlord of Seattle, as some kind of national media outlets might like to talk about, you weren't going to find her in this speech.
Yeah.
In some ways, this wasn't altogether that different of a state of the city than we've heard from Mayor Harrell or Mayor Durkin,
right?
Or
I noticed that too.
and because it had sort of overtures to all, it had overtures to business, it had overtures to community advocates, it had overtures to people who probably supported her and those who didn't. And, it was a very, I'm the mayor of everybody kind of speech.
Mm-hmm.
There was a few issues, again, particularly on surveillance and homeless encampments that didn't, where she was saying, I'm acknowledging both sides of this issue. I see points on both sides here. I think it had, of course, some of the undertones that we heard on her campaign around affordability. She talked about how she's going to have an affordability agenda and, push for making the city, she talked about some legislation around housing, particularly kind of the next step in the comprehensive plan that she's going to go bigger and bolder on. So I on balance, of course, it's early, and I think the jury is still a little bit out on what exactly she's going to do as mayor and how she's going to govern. But
Hmm.
from this speech, it didn't come across as some outlier mayor here. It
Yeah.
kind of sounded to me, in some ways like a kind of traditional left of center
Hmm.
Seattle mayor.
Yeah, she's been studying a lot of issues. I could tell that too from what she was saying. And I thought it was interesting with affordability. It was such a central concept of her campaign last fall. But again, I was kind of counting along. It was, I guess, fourth on the list, which doesn't mean it's necessarily less important. But I did see it sitting there, and there was talk about government access to affordable groceries. She was looking at housing, childcare, food, and building a small business. I think she's taking a comprehensive approach to affordability, but just a quick last touch on that in terms of what she's saying and where you see her trying to move the needle on that. Because again, a central part of her campaign, how does she actually enact any sort of policy on it as mayor right now?
Yeah, I think the thing that she talked about this bigger, bolder plan for allowing housing development, and what that is will be very interesting to see when it comes out. I assume that'll be either later this year or maybe early next year. Um, but then, in a sort of very Katie Wilson fashion, it was she kind of understands and supports the supply and demand kind of free market approach to housing, but isn't putting all of her stock into that being the solution here. So she talked a lot about uh, righting the ship on affordable housing providers, and she talked a lot about social housing and
Yeah.
where that fits in. And so it was kind of this mix of, when you're talking about housing affordability, it's sort of this mix of, you could call it the kind of abundance style
Hmm.
politics of allowing more development everywhere, mixed with this kind of slightly more, I don't want to use socialist because it's a very loaded term, but in some
Yes,
ways,
yes.
this more socialist government first approach to housing, which is public housing and its role in affordability.
Okay.
She also talked a lot about childcare.
Yeah.
She didn't say anything specifically about what the city might do beyond what it already has done. She said, in some ways, Seattle is already a leader in this space, which is
Right.
great, but also disheartening because if Seattle is a leader, then that doesn't say great things about the state of our broader
Mm.
childcare environment.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, this is always going to be the central question of her being mayor is she talked a lot about affordability, but it's not entirely clear how much power a single mayor has to move affordability. How can you make food cheaper? Food is part of a large global supply chain. Um,
Yeah.
Logistics question. Can you really bring down the cost of housing in 4 years? I don't know.
Yeah.
Might be why it was fourth on her list.
Yeah, right, right. That's a big, big, big ticket item there. So we'll definitely see what's happening next. We're going to come back to the mayor in a little bit, but I did want to bounce over to the city council. Some big news over the past couple of days here. Council member Alexis Mercedes Rink is sponsoring a bill that would ban the construction of any new jail or detention center within city limits. And there isn't a lot of talk, as a matter of fact, no talk of the word immigration in this legislation here. But David, I got to say, this is clearly meant as a pushback on ICE and the federal illegal immigration crackdown, right?
Yeah, it is. 100%. The reason there's no mention of immigration in the bill itself is because, there have been examples of federal judges striking down legislation that was tailored specifically toward the federal government. And so what they're doing here is basically they're putting a moratorium on any new detention or jail expansion in Seattle. I think the calculation is there's not likely to be any expansion or new public jail in the next year anyway.
Right.
But, there was this little piece on the US government's administrative website of some kind of pre-solicitation for a detention center, specifically an immigration detention center in Seattle,
Hmm.
which is different than, an actual request for proposals. But someone somewhere in the federal government has begun a conversation about building an immigration detention facility in Seattle. Whether or not that ever happens, hard to say,
Yeah.
but it is responding to something specific here. And so the
Yeah.
thought is, we don't think there's going to be any new public jail built here.
Right. Yeah. Like
So we
it's not
think the
like
best
King
way to
County. I know King County Jail needs some fixes, definitely, but it doesn't sound like that's really imminent in terms of that type of work going on. This wouldn't hamstring that necessarily.
No, because it allows for some minor changes to jail. So if King County Jail needed fixes, you could still do that. King County Jail could not add probably a whole new wing.
Got it.
Certainly could not build an entirely new jail, but I don't think
Yeah.
that was, I don't know that there are any plans for that anyway.
Yeah.
So again, it is clearly targeted toward immigration detention centers, but written in a way that they think will pass a little more legal muster. I don't
Got
know
it.
what it means that, frankly, that she's telling the Seattle Times, me, that this is tailored to stop immigration detention centers. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's something you could enter into the record to say, well,
Mm.
you know, sure, the legislation is written to ban all jails and detention centers, but here she is quoted in the newspaper saying this is about immigration detention. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm nor am I. And you reported on this too. Other cities and counties have passed similar measures, like the city of SeaTac, some jurisdictions in the Midwest too. Were you able to take the next step on that? Are those measures facing legal challenges? Is it too soon to tell, or what do you know about that?
I think it's too soon to tell because a lot of those measures were passed literally in the last week or
I
so.
see.
So
I
it's
see.
it's
Okay.
pretty early here.
Okay.
I would think there'd have to have be some show of harm so that it would be at, I don't know what a ban on hypothetical detention
Mm,
centers, if that can go to court or if there actually has to be a real plan for a detention center that is being disrupted for the federal government to sue. I'm not a lawyer, obviously.
yeah.
Um, so I don't know. Jury's out on that,
Yeah, yeah. All right.
so to
Still a lot
speak.
to see. Well, yeah, as a tour. All right. Well, up next, I
Yeah.
did want to bounce back to what's going on with surveillance cameras for the city of Seattle. Some notes from the mayor's State of the City, and city council members too have some big concerns here. What's the next move? More ahead on Now Hear This. Seattle's surveillance camera system is at the center of a growing controversy. A number of city council members want them to be shut down for fear that those cameras would be used by federal agents to harm Seattle's immigrant population. But there are a number of local residents who want those cameras for what they see as a boost to public safety. This is a debate we've covered here on the podcast for several months here. Mayor Katie Wilson was talking about this in her State of the City. She says, I want to hit the pause button.
I know this is a contentious issue, and I want to get it right and not rush to a particular deadline. So my team and I will continue to dig in, meet with people who have different opinions, and try to find the best way forward. My overriding goal is that whoever you are and wherever you come from, if Seattle is your home, then this is your city, and there is a place for you here.
David, you wrote about this issue recently in the Seattle Times. It appears the mayor is still getting input on surveillance cameras after speaking out against them pretty strongly on the campaign trail. I'm trying to look in the crystal ball here if you can. What does the delay from the mayor's office on this decision regarding cameras tell you? Will she shut down this expanding system, or where do you see this going?
Yeah, my honestly, my guess would be some version of allowing them to go forward with kind of new parameters around how and when they might be used or shut down. I don't know that for sure, but I think what is happening here is it's, one thing to say on the campaign trail, I oppose this expansion, but then your mayor, for example,
Hmm.
and you go to Rainier Beach High School after two students have been shot and killed and murdered, and you're talking face to face with people who, live in that neighborhood and are saying, we want cameras here. We fear for our children's safety.
Yeah,
Some students saying, I fear for my safety,
sure,
and
sure.
we think cameras would be helpful. And when you were a mayor, suddenly that's a little more complicated than just saying, I don't oppose this for these other, reasons regarding federal immigration enforcement. And I think, and that was my theory about why this delay was happening. And her office has since confirmed that basically that's what's going on here is
Yeah,
she had this position in something of a vacuum in a way on the campaign
yeah.
trail around camera enforcement, and now she's actually spoken to people who have experienced gun violence, and suddenly the calculus is a little more difficult.
I hear what you're saying, and there's also a little bit of a complicating factor here too. It's difficult to say, well, hey, you know what? The data shows in terms of quite a long history of research on these different cameras, they don't really do make that much of a difference in terms of a lot of criminal activity. And I'm just saying, there's cities like the city of Oakland who took these systems out because they said they weren't actually doing anything, weren't having
Yeah.
a positive effect at all. And I think by the same token, it's difficult to say, well, the data says this when you've got some people who are mourning the loss of unfortunately, some teenagers who passed away because of gun violence.
Yeah, exactly. Again, it is a different calculus when you are the mayor of Seattle and of course, part of the job is confronting really hard things and being around when people are going through tragic moments and being something of a comforting force. And I talked to the head of the Rainier Beach Parent Teacher Student Association,
Yeah.
who said, I loved that Katie Wilson came down, the mayor came down. I thought she was really empathetic. I thought she was really good at listening. And this is somebody who had voted for Bruce Harrell and was
Yeah.
really impressed by how Katie Wilson held herself and the fact that
Yes.
she showed up to this memorial and was feeling very good about that. And she was saying, if she wants to turn off these cameras or slow this expansion, I'm going to fight her on it because
Yep.
I think this is a really important thing. And so, again, and this is, I know there are a lot of civil rights concerns about these cameras. This is, this is a black woman who lives in the Rainier
Hmm.
Beach area saying this, that my community, I want this for my
Yep.
children.
Yeah.
That's just, again, when you're mayor and you're confronting real tragedy, uh, in a very real way, in a way that you
Yeah.
probably did not on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
Those decisions are just a little more complicated, perhaps, than, briefings you might get in a binder around all the pros and cons.
Fair enough. And take me that one last step if you can, because I think there's a real challenge here, at least in my view of this. It feels kind of black and white. Either the cameras are on or they're off. You can't turn them on and somehow put a magic filter on them so they don't take video of people who are immigrants. And I'm not trying to be glib about this. I just don't know how you would actually do it. Is there a middle ground available on an issue like this? Are there some parameters, as you're saying, that could be put in place that could actually provide some more control that the city wants? Help me out with that. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a good. I actually don't know.
Yeah,
I think the city council already has in place, if there is a subpoena for these cameras, they shut them off
for 60
for 60
days. Yeah,
days.
yeah.
So that is already in place. But even on the SPD's website, they say, the best we can do is not collect immigration information because then, we can't give them something that we don't have.
Right.
But the reality is, if they come with a subpoena signed by a judge, we can't say no. And I don't know if there's something that the mayor wants to try to do so that they could say no. It seems probably illegal.
Yeah.
So again, yeah, I think this is kind of the first of a couple, maybe one of a couple major political tests for the mayor, which is does what you say on the campaign trail stand up once you're actually mayor? Um, we can get into the homeless encampment question
We
here, but
will.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
both of those are really putting to test um, the reality of being a candidate versus the reality of being the mayor.
Absolutely true. We're going to come back to the mayor in a second, but I did want to jump on another issue. We're talking about police. Let's talk about this one, the much awaited Sentinel report on the actions of the Seattle Police Department. This was at a rally by a conservative Christian group in Cal Anderson Park. There was an examination of this. Seattle's Office of the Inspector General found a number of problems with this response from the SPD, including failed communications and cultural ignorance by officers, especially when a commander was recorded on a body camera saying, "We are past talking. We're here to F people up now." David, just looking at this from a 10,000-foot view, what did this report say to you, the Sentinel report?
That a lot of what caused friction between particularly the residents of Capitol Hill and the Seattle Police Department in 2020 still exists today. Um, I think there is a little bit of a culture, and I would say it's driven a, kind of by Mike Solon, or at least Mike Solon, the
Mm,
head of the union, or at least Mike Solon is a representative of
yeah.
this kind of sense of some members of the police department feeling like they're at war with their own city.
Mm,
Um, certainly Mike Solon projects that message. We've seen that a few times. And the union posts all these "This is Seattle"
sure.
uh, memes or whatever you want to say on Twitter, or talks about defeating the socialists in City
Sure.
Hall and
Sure.
things like this. This sort of like um, conflict stance that
Yes.
that perhaps is not the healthiest thing for a police department and a city to have toward one another. And I think,
About the most diplomatic way you could put that. Keep
yeah,
going. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think a lot of that is confirmed in this report that this the police department, or at least certain members of the police department, appear to not be taking this sort of de-escalation piece of this
Yeah.
as seriously as they should be. I'm not saying that this was I'm not saying that there wasn't anything that, I mean, it was a chaotic event.
Sure.
It was,
Yeah.
it was it seemed to have been kind of poorly planned from the start, the
Yeah, like
response
the
here.
Seattle Parks approves the permit and then doesn't tell the SPD about it until like a week and a half before it's supposed to
Yeah,
happen. That didn't help at all.
exactly. And I think there was that whole there was a great sort of contrast there between that first event and then there was a second event at City Hall.
Hmm.
And the second event was, I mean, it was tense, of course, but there wasn't major clashes because they had kind of learned and they put up fences and they put up these physical barriers between the two groups so that there wasn't these direct confrontations. The Capitol Hill event, there wasn't any of that. And so what you have is this sort of hodgepodge attempt by the Seattle Police Department to keep these two groups apart.
Yeah.
I think, again, there was the comments of that officer suggest there's a bit of lost the some members of the police department are perhaps still a little bit turned against the city from
Mm,
2020. They feel like they have run out of patience, or however you want to say it, with
sure.
protesters on Capitol Hill, and I think that is creates situations like this that are ripe for clashes between the police department and members of the public that
Yeah.
don't end particularly well.
Right. And you're going down the path that I want to go because I'm just thinking about the future of crowd management for the SPD. We had this federal consent decree that wrapped up last year after more than a decade being in place there. It was hanging over the SPD. It's over now. But this issue of crowd control was definitely a lingering concern for the judge who ended that oversight process. Help me out here. Where does an event like this, where does a report like this guide the SPD forward when it comes to this rather challenging issue of crowd control?
Yeah, in some ways it's a test of this system because before you had this backstop of this federal judge who was there, and he was a forceful backstop at times, which is that if he felt like something had broken down or gone poorly with the Seattle Police Department, he would call a hearing, a public hearing, and with the force of literally the force of the federal government, say, you have to do this. I don't think this is right. You have to fix this, so on and so forth. That doesn't exist anymore. And what is supposed to exist in his stead and is this accountability structure that has been
Yeah.
built, which includes the Office of Police Accountability, Office of Inspector General, and Community Police Commission.
Yeah.
Those three entities are kind of supposed to fill the role that the federal government and this federal judge had been filling for the last 10 years to prop up whatever progress has been made under the consent decree.
Yeah.
In some ways we're seeing that, which is that this report is being aired and we're talking about it on the
Yeah.
radio and
Hmm.
it's getting aired in city council meetings. The question, though, is whether the police department or members of the police department fear that kind of report in the same way that they might fear backlash from a federal judge.
Yeah.
That I mean, again, that's the theory of this whole system: is a federal judge demands this stuff be put into place, the city puts it in place, federal judge leaves, the system works.
Hmm.
Whether or not the system works, I think we haven't had enough samples to really know.
Yeah. Test is ongoing, as it were. All right. Well, coming up, a closer look at what Mayor Wilson's plans are when it comes to Seattle's homelessness response, especially after an unauthorized encampment was cleared in the Ballard neighborhood very recently, following a weeks-long delay. That's ahead on What's Next. David, I wanted to pull together two stories into one here talking about homelessness. I wanted to pull apart what Mayor Wilson said about this issue in her State of the City address and match that up with a recent encampment clearing in Ballard, which she put on pause a few weeks ago to try to help more people into housing. So, first looking at Ballard. At the end of the day, the closure was delayed by about a month, and as the mayor's office reported, because of that, 6 more people were able to move into tiny houses or other housing options. I know that sounds good in a lot of ways, but then what does that sound like to people in Ballard who wanted this encampment gone a month ago? Help me out with that, just in terms of what happened in Ballard there.
Yeah, well, there's kind of two layers here. The first is that it's important to remember that the Wilson administration is actually removing encampments at basically the same clip as Mayor Bruce Harrell. When I think I don't know what the number is now, but when this Ballard encampment story first came up, I think the mayor had been in office for what, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and there had already been more than 100 other clearings of encampments. So the mayor has been actually quite vocal about the fact that if an encampment is in the public right of way or is in a park, it is going to be removed. And her office hasn't been shy about that. Her office
Yeah.
has been advertising the fact that a lot of encampments are being moved. Then you have other pieces like, then there's this other question of, okay, is this what is the strategy then around these kind of larger encampments that maybe uh, crop up over and over and
Sure.
pose kind of a frustration to the businesses around them. And the theory of the Wilson administration is we will devote more time and energy into finding permanent places for these people to go, and
Yeah.
then that encampment shouldn't return, or
Yeah.
that's at least the idea. And that basic idea actually I think has quite broad support among all people. Around the time of this encampment pause, I talked to the manager of the Salmon Bay Sand and Gravel right
Yeah.
there, which is the business closest to the encampment. And he
Yep.
was, had immense frustrations with this encampment being there, said it was causing safety problems. They had lost, there had been some theft.
Hmm.
And then at the same time said, if this mayor has a plan that does not include this being swept to somewhere else and then returning a few weeks later, I'm all ears. This
Yeah.
person was not
Yeah.
particularly enthused with how the previous administration had handled the issue.
Hmm.
And so in some ways, I think the mayor has a lot of support here to take some kind of different approach, so long as it actually does result in the kind of permanent
Hmm.
um, solution for these encampments that people actually find somewhere permanent to go.
Yeah.
Um, the major questions are the question of space is, where do these people actually go?
Yeah.
And time, it
Mm.
takes a lot of resources and person power to go out to this encampment day after day after day
Yep.
and work with people and build relationships with people and actually get them somewhere. Um, I think that is sort of the ideal, and actually that is not altogether that different than what
Yeah.
mayors Durkin and Harrell did early in their administrations. I'm thinking about Woodlawn Park near Woodland Park
Yep.
Zoo.
Yep.
That was
That was a big
similar
one.
approach. It was this big encampment, and there was a ton of outreach done there. It was done very slowly over the
Hmm.
course of weeks.
Hmm.
It seemed to be a success, but when push came to shove on the number of other encampments around the city, there were a lot of 48-hour notice sweeps that didn't include a ton of outreach or offers of shelter. And
Yeah.
so again, it's when you take the example of one encampment,
Yeah.
you can do this kind of stuff, and it sounds pretty good, and people are, I think generally speaking, happy to see when people get into homes and
Oh yeah.
shelters or whatever it may be. It's just, can you scale that to the level that it is actually significantly different than what the city has been doing for the last 10 plus years?
And I think this leads to what could be another major piece of legislation for the Wilson administration. We talked about this idea of surveillance cameras and what the mayor wants to do here, but she basically was saying she's working on a bill to send to the council, quote, in the coming weeks to fund shelter expansion, make it faster and easier to build shelter in Seattle. She even doubled down on that campaign promise to add 1,000 new units this year. Do you have any insight about what this bill might look like, David, and this road to 1,000 new units? Some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, she said she would ask for money, and there's
Step
not
one.
money there.
Yeah.
So what that probably means is uh, the proposal will include diverting money from other things that the Human Services Department does in order to fund shelter. And if that is the case, then the calculation is there's no more important thing for the city to be doing than standing up a lot of shelter, no matter what other good work the Human Services Department is doing. She's probably calculating that the top priority needs to be standing up new shelter, because again, if you have shelter and you have enough shelter, that kind of unlocks a lot more. Then you have the ability to go to these encampments and
Yeah.
say, look, you can't be here, but we have all this new shelter, and you can go there, and it just makes those conversations a lot easier, and the long-term solution to this a lot more tangible.
Yeah.
The question is always, where's it going to go? Who's going to host it? Um, I do think it is a different tone to say, we're just going to go all in on emergency shelter. It's not that past mayors haven't done that, but there has been this kind of split focus on
Hmm.
permanent housing and emergency shelter. Permanent
Yep.
housing, of course, is very expensive and difficult to staff.
Yeah.
If she truly, to get to 4,000 units in 4 years or 1,000 units this year, it will have to be kind of an all hands,
Yeah.
the chips all in on emergency shelter approach, finding open city lots, churches, organizations, who might host these things. So, again, we can talk endlessly about how she is or isn't approaching the Ballard homeless encampment differently.
Hmm.
But if there is not shelter, if the
On the
real
other
the
side
real
of it. Yeah.
the real thing is she has to make good on that 4,000 units promise.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the reality is it's just not going to be that different than what the past mayors have been doing.
Fair. Yeah. Really interested to see what kind of legislation she comes up with. All right, David, it's time to wrap up. And this is kind of a big hitter, but I wanted to throw it out there. I saw you writing on social media recently about the incursion of AI into our work of writing and journalism, and this push from some newsrooms to urge young journalists to lean in on AI, let AI do the writing while the journalist works on, I guess, story gathering and relationship building. I know this is a big issue to tackle at the end of the show, but what are your concerns about this? I have some too, but what are your thoughts about this?
It kills the craft.
Yeah.
You know, it's I we get so obsessed with doing things quickly, we forget that there's value in just the doing.
Yeah.
I like to write.
Me too.
I got into journalism because I like to write, and I learned how to. I was a writer first, and then learned how to report.
Mm.
I would. It's the part, this is not certainly not a universal opinion among journalists, but for me, it is the part I like the most. I like the writing part. And if writing wasn't part of this job, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, that's the part where I feel like I'm getting the most creative and really trying to put all the different pieces together. And that's where, not that a computer brain can't do it, but I just feel like the ownership of it or the understanding of it is completely different if it was outsourced in that way.
Yeah, well, one of the something an editor told me early on was, I don't know if it's 100% true, but basically, there's no such thing as writer's block. It just means you need to do more reporting.
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
but the point there is that what writing does is it shows you, it forces you to think, and it shows you what you know and what you don't. It forces you to like put things in order, contextualize things, and that does a lot more than just the actual words on the page. As a reporter, it makes you kind of fully understand what it is that you're actually writing about. And if you go to write and you can't do it, it probably means you don't understand it well enough and need to go back and do more reporting.
Yeah.
And with AI, you just lose all that. We don't have to, it is okay for us to keep some human creativity and toil. We don't need to outsource everything.
I'm with you on that. Unfortunately, though, you cannot spell Brian Callanan, nor can you spell David Croman without AI. I'm just throwing it out there,
That's
man.
true.
It's everywhere. It's all around us. All right. We'll see where we go next on that, David. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks to all of our patrons, and a big shout out to Caden. Once again, good to have you joining us. Become a patron. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks for the support. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Apple, Spotify, wherever you're tuning in. Canada back on top this week for countries listening outside of the U.S. Take off, eh? And thank you. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.